Alright, so now that I've refined our understanding of angles, now that I've expanded our knowledge of angles into radian angles and not just degree angles, we're ready for the next step into trigonometry. And the next step into trigonometry is by looking at the trig functions. And so the first question I want to ask is what is, and I really want to focus on, what are these trig functions? Like, what is sine, what is cosine, what is tangent? And when I ask that question, some of you may respond with like, oh, I know, it's SOHCAHTOA. And now that I've written it, you're like, yeah, I remember that, cool, right on, not good enough. And I don't mean that in a mean way, but there's more to it than that. And when we get into calculus, I feel like the exciting thing about calculus is that so much of the stuff that we did before has the ability to start making deeper sense. Right? So before I get into what these things are, I need to make sure you guys know what a function is. Right? What is a function? A function is something that takes an input and gives you an output. And in fact, the key thing about a function is that when you put in one input, you get back one output. It never happens that you put in 3 and you get back like 17 or maybe 25 or I don't know, maybe the square root of 7. When you put in 7, you get back 2 or you get back 1. You get back one thing, right? So, if someone were to tell you, for instance, or rather, suppose I asked you the question, what is the sine of 30 degrees? Right? Even that's telling. You'll notice that the thing that you are putting in to sine, the input of sine is an angle. Right? And the sine of 30 degrees, it turns out, it's actually a nice number, it turns out the sine of 30 degrees is exactly 1/2. Right? So when you do sine, the input is an angle. The thing that you get out, the output, is a ratio. It's a ratio of the sides of a triangle. Right? And this is where your SOHCAHTOA starts to become valuable. So, I'm now ready to start answering the question more. What is sine? If someone asks you, what is the sine of an angle? It is the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse. That's where the SO in SOHCAHTOA comes from, S-O-H. So the sine of an angle, when you plug in an angle, it's going to give you back a ratio. It's going to give you back a ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse. Okay? Similarly, the cosine of an angle will be the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. Right? And right now I'm basically reviewing the concept of SOHCAHTOA, but more important than that, and this is so vitally crucial to me, when somebody says what's the sine of something, that something should always, always, always be thought of as an angle. And the thing you get back, do not ever mistake. The thing you get back is always a ratio. If you got back 0.3, fine, good for you. The ratio of those sides is 0.3. Okay? I will go ahead and write down the other ones really quickly here. The tangent of an angle is the opposite side over the adjacent. Turns out a more fun way of thinking about that over time is going to be the sine of the angle over the cosine of the angle. And all of the other trig ones can actually be thought of in comparison to these. It turns out that the cosecant of an angle is the hypotenuse over the opposite, so I tend to just think about that as 1 over the sine of the angle. Right? The secant of an angle is 1 over the cosine of the angle. And the cotangent of an angle is 1 over the tangent of that angle. And to be honest, all of these things should be memorized sometime soon. If you're a flashcard kind of person, you might want to make some flashcards. Like the more you are willing to start memorizing things earlier, the easier it is for you in the long run, because there's a lot of stuff we need to get into our brains. But remember, and I've said this multiple times, I'm saying it because it's important, you need to know that when somebody asks you a question like, hey, what's the tangent of 15 degrees? The thing that's being plugged in here always needs to be thought of as an angle, and the thing you get back, whatever this thing is, it's going to be a ratio. It'll be a ratio of the sides of some triangle. Now, there are also things called inverse trig functions, and I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on this here. I'm going to cover this in a lot more depth in a later video, but I just wanted to present the idea. Inverse trig functions you've either seen as like arc sine of x, or they'll write them as a sine with a little -1 of x. And I need to clarify something right now. You guys all know when you put a -1 power on something, it usually means 1 over that. That's not what this means. This does not mean 1 over sine x, which would actually be cosecant x. It's not what it means at all. This means the inverse function of sine. And pay close attention to this. Normally, we take the sine of an angle, and we get back a ratio. Right? Inverse sine works in exactly the opposite manner. With inverse sine, you take inverse sine and you feed it the ratio. When you plug the ratio of the opposite on hypotenuse sides into this inverse sine, it will give you back the angle that had that sine measurement. So for instance, if we actually take the little factoid I put on the other page, I said that the sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. Right? So if I were to ask you, hey, what's the inverse sine of 1/2? It's effectively me saying, hey everybody, I already know that the sine was 1/2. Can you tell me what angle that came from? And in this case, of course, we can say that, that came from a 30-degree angle. Sine and inverse sine are inverses of one another, right? They switch their input and their output. So in a nutshell, that's what inverse trig functions are. Like I said, we're going to cover that on, it'll either be day 3 or day 4. It comes a little bit later down the line. But the idea is, we'll get into this later. This is just the basic idea now.